Tonight, you are listening to true crime for sleep. There is no music here, no sharp transitions, and no urgency in the pacing. Just a calm voice, steady and unhurried, allowing the night to settle naturally around you. If you can, dim the lights where you are, let the room soften. Allow your body to rest in whatever position feels most comfortable. You do not need to concentrate closely on every word. You can listen lightly, letting the story move past you, the way distant sounds move through the dark. The stories told here are real, but they are shared with care. There are no graphic descriptions, no shock-driven details, and no pressure to stay alert. The purpose is not to disturb, but to create a quiet space where your thoughts can slow and gently drift toward rest. Tonight's story is not defined by a single moment, but by years of legal process, reversals, and careful examination. It is a case that unfolded not only in police files, but in courtrooms, appeals chambers, and public debate. A case where certainty shifted over time, and where the search for truth followed a complex path. This is the murder of Meredith Kercher. Meredith was a young British student living in Italy, spending a year abroad in the historic city of Perugia. What should have been a period of study, exploration, and independence instead became the center of one of the most closely examined criminal cases of the modern era. Unlike many stories, this one does not move in a straight line. It moves slowly, sometimes backward, sometimes forward again. Verdicts were reached, then questioned. Convictions were issued, then overturned. The meaning of evidence changed as it passed through different courts and interpretations. Because this is a sleep-focused documentary, we will take our time. We will move carefully through confirmed facts, and where disputes exist, they will be named clearly and left separate. No speculation will be presented as truth. No assumptions will be asked of you. This is a story about law as much as loss, about how justice systems work under pressure, about how evidence can be read differently over time, and about how a single event can echo for years, touching many lives far beyond the place where it began. As you listen, you do not need to form conclusions. You do not need to weigh arguments or decide what you believe. This story does not ask you to judge. It only asks you to listen quietly, and then allow it to rest. Take a slow breath in, and let it out gently. Feel the weight of the day releasing from your body. The world outside your room has slowed. There is nowhere you need to go, and nothing you need to resolve tonight. This is a story that will unfold calmly, through place, time, and careful reflection. It begins not with noise or chaos, but with ordinary life continuing as expected. A student city, a shared house, and a night that changed everything. As the darkness deepens, we begin there. Perugia sits on a hill in central Italy, overlooking valleys that have carried human life for centuries. It is an old city, shaped by layers of history, where stone streets wind between medieval buildings and everyday life unfolds at a measured pace. Churches, small piazzas, cafes, and student housing exist side by side, creating a rhythm that feels both ancient and youthful at the same time. For many years, Perugia has been known as a student city. Universities draw young people from across Italy and from abroad, especially for language study and cultural exchange. English is commonly heard alongside Italian, and it is not unusual to see international students navigating the narrow streets with maps, backpacks, and notebooks in hand. The city carries a sense of temporary belonging, where people arrive for a season of learning and then move on. Daily life in Perugia follows familiar patterns. Mornings begin quietly, with shutters opening and small shops preparing for the day. Afternoons bring students to classes and cafes. Evenings gather people into shared spaces, where conversation flows easily, and the city feels social without being overwhelming. It is a place where walking is part of daily life, and where distances feel manageable rather than intimidating. For students living there, Perugia often feels safe. The historic center is compact, well lit, and busy enough to avoid feeling isolated. People move around on foot late into the evening, especially in student neighborhoods. The sense of danger that might exist in larger cities is muted here, replaced by familiarity and repetition. Many students live in shared houses or apartments, often old buildings adapted for modern use. These homes are rarely luxurious, but they are practical and social. Roommates come and go on different schedules, sharing kitchens, hallways, and routines. Independence grows naturally in these spaces, shaped by trust and casual responsibility. In the mid-2000s, Perugia was particularly popular with international students. Study abroad programs emphasized immersion, encouraging students to live among locals rather than in isolated dormitories. This created a sense of openness, where young people learned to navigate a foreign culture while forming close bonds with others doing the same. The city itself did not feel like a place where violence intruded into everyday life. Crime existed, as it does everywhere, but it was not something students expected to encounter personally. Nights were often spent studying, socializing, or simply returning home along routes that had become familiar within weeks. This atmosphere matters because it shaped assumptions. People believed the city was predictable, that routines would hold, that ordinary nights would end quietly, that shared houses, though imperfect, were safe spaces where nothing truly alarming would occur. Perugia did not announce danger. It did not feel like a place where a crime would echo around the world. It felt like a place where young people came to learn, to grow, and to live briefly within history before returning home. And it is within this setting of stone streets, student routines, and quiet confidence that this story begins. Not with fear, but with normal life continuing as expected, unaware that its sense of calm was about to be permanently altered. Meredith Kercher was a young woman defined by curiosity, warmth, and a thoughtful approach to life. She grew up in England within a close and supportive family, where education, kindness, and independence were encouraged. Those who knew her described her as bright and considerate, someone who listened carefully and formed strong, genuine connections with the people around her. Family played an important role in Meredith's life. She was close to her parents and siblings, and her relationships were grounded in trust and open communication. This sense of stability gave her the confidence to explore the world beyond home, knowing she was supported even when she was far away. Her decision to study abroad was not an escape, but an extension of that encouragement to learn and experience new places. Academically, Meredith was motivated and engaged. She approached her studies seriously, but without rigidity. Learning was something she enjoyed, not something she endured. She was particularly interested in languages and culture, which made the idea of living in another country appealing rather than intimidating. Choosing to spend time in Italy was part of this natural curiosity. Perugia offered an opportunity to immerse herself in a different way of life, to practice language skills, and to experience daily routines unlike those she had known at home. For many students, study abroad represents a brief chapter of independence, and for Meredith, it was exactly that. A chance to grow quietly, away from familiar structures, while still remaining connected to them. In Italy, Meredith adapted in the way many thoughtful young people do. She balanced independence with caution. She explored the city, attended classes, and formed friendships, while also maintaining contact with her family back home. Nothing about her behavior suggested recklessness or detachment from her roots. She lived in shared accommodation, a common arrangement for students in Perugia. This brought together people from different backgrounds, each with their own schedules and habits. It was not unusual, and it reflected the informal, communal way student life often unfolds in historic cities. Those who encountered Meredith during this time remembered her as approachable and kind. She was not someone who sought attention, but she was open and present in social settings. Her personality did not dominate a room, but it made people feel comfortable within it. Importantly, Meredith's life in Italy was not defined by drama or conflict. There were no known crises or major disruptions shaping her days. She was living an ordinary student life, filled with small routines, learning experiences, and plans for the future. This ordinariness matters. Meredith was not a symbol or a mystery before her death. She was a daughter, a sister, a student, and a young woman temporarily living far from home, doing what countless others have done before and since. Her story begins not with danger or uncertainty, but with a life that felt steady and purposeful. A life moving forward quietly, shaped by family, learning, and the simple belief that the world was something to be explored carefully. And it is from that grounded, ordinary life that everything else unfolded. The house Meredith lived in was a typical student residence, set within the historic fabric of Perugia. It was an older building adapted for shared living, with separate bedrooms, common areas, and routines shaped by the comings and goings of multiple people. Nothing about it stood out as unusual. It was one of many such houses occupied by students who balanced independence with shared responsibility. Daily life there followed a loose rhythm rather than a strict schedule. Roommates attended classes at different times, returned home at different hours, and shared spaces without constant coordination. Kitchens were used in turns. Doors opened and closed throughout the day. Privacy and proximity existed side by side, as they often do in student housing. Meredith's routine was simple and predictable. She attended her classes, spent time studying, and stayed in contact with friends and family. She moved through the city on foot, following familiar paths that quickly became part of her daily life. Evenings were usually quiet, shaped by study, rest, or casual social time rather than late nights out. Shared living requires a level of trust. People assume that others will respect boundaries, lock doors, and look out for one another in small ways. Over time, this trust becomes invisible. It is not questioned daily. It simply exists in the background, supporting ordinary life. The house itself reflected that assumption of safety. It was not treated as a place where vigilance was required. Doors were opened and closed routinely. People came home expecting the space to remain what it had always been: familiar, predictable, uneventful. Living with others also means that solitude and company alternate naturally. There are moments when the house is full of activity, and moments when it feels empty, even if someone is technically inside. These quiet stretches are common and rarely cause concern. For Meredith, this arrangement allowed independence without isolation. She had her own space, her own routine, and the presence of others nearby. It was a balance many students find reassuring, especially when living in a foreign country. Nothing in the daily rhythm of the house suggested danger. There were no reports of ongoing conflict that shaped daily life. No sense that routines were unstable or tense. Everything about the environment pointed toward normal student living, carried along by habit rather than vigilance. That normality is important to understand, because it shaped expectations. It shaped the belief that returning home meant returning to safety, that the house was a place where the outside world paused, where the day ended quietly. The routines continued without disruption until they did not. And when they broke not with warning, but with silence, leaving behind a space that looked the same as it always had, but no longer felt that way. What had been ordinary became unrecognizable, not because the house changed, but because what happened within it changed everything that followed. The evening of November 1st, 2007, began as a public holiday in Italy. The city of Perugia moved at a gentler pace than usual, with many students free from classes and routines, slightly relaxed. Streets were active earlier in the evening, then gradually quieted as night settled in. Meredith spent part of that day following ordinary patterns. She was in contact with people close to her, maintaining the small connections that anchored her time abroad to home and familiarity. Nothing in her communications suggested distress or concern. The tone of the day remained calm and unremarkable. As evening approached, Meredith made plans consistent with her routine. She was not preparing for anything unusual. There was no indication that she expected the night to unfold differently from others before it. Her movements, as later reconstructed, reflected familiarity with her surroundings and confidence in her environment. The city itself transitioned into nighttime in the way it often did. Restaurants closed, streets emptied, and the historic center grew quieter. Footsteps echoed more clearly against stone, windows dimmed, the social energy of the day receded into stillness. At some point that night, Meredith returned to the house she shared with others. The details of her movements have been examined carefully over time, with emphasis placed only on what could be confirmed. Investigators focused on timelines that were supported by evidence, avoiding assumptions about moments that could not be verified. What is known is that Meredith was inside the house that night. Beyond that, the sequence of events becomes narrower, shaped by physical evidence and later court findings, rather than eyewitness accounts. There were no confirmed signs of disturbance reported at the time. No neighbors raised alarms. No immediate indication that something was wrong. The quiet of the house would have felt familiar. Shared student homes often settle into silence unevenly, with some rooms occupied and others empty, without this feeling unusual. The absence of noise does not automatically suggest absence of safety. This night did not announce itself as different. There were no public signals, no visible disruption that marked it as extraordinary. Like many nights before it, it seemed to pass unnoticed by the wider city. It is only in hindsight that meaning gathers around these hours. At the time, they were simply part of a calendar day ending quietly. A routine night in a student city. A return home. A closing door. Later investigations would attempt to reconstruct these hours with precision, measuring movements in minutes and distances in steps. But precision cannot recreate experience. It cannot fully restore what the night felt like before it was redefined by what followed. What matters here is restraint. This story does not benefit from filling gaps with imagined scenes or emotional projections. The night is best understood through what can be said clearly and carefully. Meredith was alive that evening. She returned to her home. The city around her went to sleep. And somewhere within those quiet hours, an event occurred that would not be discovered until later, transforming an ordinary night into the beginning of a long and complex legal history. At the time, however, the night remained quiet, unmarked, and unaware of the weight it would eventually carry. The following day began without immediate alarm. In shared student housing, it was not unusual for routines to fall out of sync. People slept late, spent time elsewhere, or moved through the day independently. Absence, at first, did not register as danger. Concern began to surface gradually. Meredith did not respond as expected. Attempts to reach her went unanswered. Small details that would normally pass without notice started to feel out of place. The house itself appeared largely unchanged, yet something about the stillness felt different. When entry was made into Meredith's room, the situation shifted from uncertainty to alarm. The scene indicated that something serious had occurred. At this point, authorities were contacted, and the matter moved quickly from private concern to formal investigation. Police arrived and secured the property. Their initial focus was on preservation rather than interpretation. Movement within the house was limited. Observations were documented carefully. The goal in these first moments was not explanation, but protection of what might later become evidence. Early assessments noted that the situation was not consistent with a simple accident. Officers recognized immediately that the case required careful handling. Specialized units became involved, and the house was treated as a potential crime scene rather than a domestic incident. The surrounding area was examined. Entry points were observed. Items within shared spaces were noted for their condition and placement. Nothing was assumed. Everything was recorded. As word spread, the tone of the response changed. What began as concern among roommates became a coordinated effort involving multiple levels of law enforcement. The case moved rapidly beyond the boundaries of student life and into the formal structure of criminal investigation. Communication with Meredith's family was handled with care. Distance complicated everything. Information had to travel across borders, and decisions had to be made quickly under emotional strain. The reality of what had happened began to settle heavily on those closest to her. Police statements at this stage were limited. Investigators avoided speculation. They focused on establishing timelines, confirming movements, and determining what could be said with certainty. The priority was accuracy, not reassurance. Media attention followed swiftly. A crime involving an international student drew interest beyond Perugia. But in these early hours, investigators remained focused inward, working methodically within the boundaries of the evidence available to them. The discovery marked a clear dividing line. Life before that moment belonged to routine and expectation. Life after it belonged to procedure, inquiry, and scrutiny. What had been a shared home became a place of examination. What had been private life became part of a public process. And what had been an ordinary student experience ended abruptly, replaced by a long and complex search for truth that would unfold over many years. The immediate police response did not offer answers. It marked the beginning of asking the right questions, carefully and without haste. In the early days of the investigation, attention turned toward the people closest to Meredith and the environment she lived in. This is a standard approach in any serious criminal inquiry. Investigators begin where access is most likely, not because of assumption, but because proximity often provides the clearest starting point. Those who shared the house were questioned in detail. Daily routines were examined carefully. Who was present, who was absent, and when movements occurred became central questions. Investigators sought clarity rather than conclusions, working to understand how an ordinary living arrangement functioned on a normal day. Early interviews were thorough and repeated. Small inconsistencies were noted, not as accusations, but as points requiring clarification. In stressful situations, memory can fracture, and investigators are trained to distinguish confusion from deception through time and repetition rather than haste. As the inquiry developed, focus began to shift. Evidence gathered from the scene suggested that the event was contained within a limited time frame and space. This narrowed the field of inquiry, directing attention toward individuals who could be placed near the house around the relevant hours. At this stage, investigative momentum can feel unsettling from the outside. The process is not linear. Attention moves, retracts, and redirects as new information is assessed. What appears certain one day may be questioned the next, not because of failure, but because scrutiny deepens. Public awareness grew rapidly, and with it came pressure. International interest intensified the need for visible progress, even as investigators remained cautious about drawing conclusions too early. Law enforcement faced the challenge of balancing thoroughness with urgency, knowing that premature certainty could compromise the case. During this period, investigative focus did not remain fixed. It shifted as evidence was evaluated and re-evaluated. This movement is often misinterpreted as indecision, but in reality, it reflects a willingness to follow facts rather than narratives. Some early assumptions were later reconsidered. Others were reinforced by forensic findings and corroborated timelines. Each shift represented an adjustment to understanding, not a retreat from responsibility. What mattered most in these early stages was control. Control of the scene, control of information, control of interpretation. Investigators understood that once a narrative enters public space, it is difficult to remove, even if later evidence contradicts it. As days passed, the investigation became more structured. Lines of inquiry were formalized. Legal processes began to shape how information was gathered and shared. The case moved steadily away from immediate response and into a prolonged judicial path. For those involved, this phase was defined by uncertainty. Nothing had settled. Nothing had been finalized. The direction of the case remained open, shaped by evidence still being examined rather than conclusions already formed. The focus shifted, not because investigators were searching blindly, but because the truth required patience. And in cases like this, patience is often the most difficult discipline to maintain. The case eventually moved from investigation into the formal structure of the Italian court system, where facts, interpretations, and legal standards began to shape the narrative more decisively. This transition marked a significant change in tone. What had been uncertainty and inquiry became argument and judgment, guided by procedure rather than possibility. The first trial brought together prosecutors, defense teams, judges, and forensic experts. Evidence collected during the investigation was presented in detail. Timelines were reconstructed. Statements were examined closely. Each side offered its interpretation of what the evidence showed and what it did not. Italian criminal trials differ from those in some other countries. Proceedings are overseen by judges rather than juries alone, and the process places significant weight on written records, expert testimony, and judicial reasoning. This structure meant that the case unfolded slowly, with careful attention to documentation and legal argument. Prosecutors argued that the available evidence supported a shared responsibility for the crime. Their case relied on forensic findings, behavioral interpretations, and reconstructed timelines. They presented these elements as forming a coherent narrative of events that occurred within the house. Defense teams challenged these interpretations. They questioned the handling and reliability of certain forensic evidence. They raised concerns about assumptions made during the early investigation and argued that alternative explanations had not been sufficiently explored. Throughout the trial, the court heard from experts whose analyses sometimes conflicted. This is not unusual in complex cases. Forensic science does not always speak with a single voice, and interpretation can vary depending on methodology, context, and experience. The atmosphere of the trial was intense, but procedural. Emotional moments existed, but the dominant tone was legal rather than dramatic. The focus remained on evidence and argument rather than spectacle. When verdicts were delivered, they carried enormous weight. The court reached convictions that reflected its assessment of the evidence presented. These decisions were not framed as provisional. They were formal, legal conclusions reached after extended deliberation. For many observers, the convictions created a sense of closure. For others, they raised further questions. Complex cases rarely settle public debate entirely, especially when interpretations of evidence differ sharply. It is important to note that convictions in this system were not the final word. Italian law allows for multiple levels of appeal, and verdicts can be revisited as part of the normal judicial process. The trial did not end the case. It advanced it into its next phase. The first trial established an official narrative, but it did not silence dissenting views. Legal certainty existed within the courtroom, while uncertainty continued outside it. This tension would shape everything that followed. At this point, the case entered a long period where truth and judgment would be tested repeatedly, not through new events, but through re-examination of what had already been said, done, and decided. The convictions marked a conclusion of one chapter of legal process, but they did not bring finality. Instead, they set the stage for continued scrutiny, appeals, and a prolonged effort to determine how justice should ultimately be understood. As the case moved into the appeals phase, the sense of certainty established by the first trial began to loosen. Appeals are not a rejection of justice, but a continuation of it, designed to examine whether procedures were followed correctly and whether conclusions were supported by reliable interpretation of evidence. In this case, the appeal process would become as significant as the original trial itself. The appellate court reviewed the record carefully, focusing on forensic evidence and the reasoning used to interpret it. Particular attention was given to how evidence had been collected, preserved, and analyzed. Questions were raised about contamination, methodology, and the strength of inferences drawn from limited material. These were not emotional arguments, but technical ones, grounded in standards of proof. As experts were re-examined, disagreements that had existed quietly during the first trial became more prominent. Some forensic conclusions were challenged for lacking sufficient scientific reliability. Others were criticized for being interpreted too broadly. The appeal court was tasked not with deciding what might have happened, but with deciding what could be said with confidence. This process led to a significant legal shift. Convictions from the first trial were overturned, and acquittals were issued at this stage. The court concluded that certain evidence did not meet the threshold required to sustain guilt beyond reasonable doubt. These decisions altered the legal landscape of the case dramatically. For observers, this reversal was jarring. What had once been presented as settled truth was now officially reconsidered. The case demonstrated how legal systems allow conclusions to change, not because truth is unstable, but because understanding deepens through scrutiny. However, the story did not end there. In the Italian system, further appeals are possible, and the case moved once again into review. Higher courts examined whether the appellate decisions themselves were sound, focusing on whether legal standards had been applied correctly, rather than reassessing evidence directly. This led to additional reversals, reinstatements, and retrials. Each decision added another layer of complexity. Legal outcomes shifted, not because facts changed, but because interpretation and legal reasoning continued to evolve. What mattered was not speed, but correctness. For those following the case, this period was often confusing. Headlines announced new outcomes that seemed to contradict earlier ones. Public confidence fluctuated. Some viewed the reversals as proof of wrongful conviction. Others saw them as procedural complexity, rather than exoneration. Throughout this time, the courts emphasized restraint in language. Decisions were written carefully, explaining reasoning in detail, rather than declaring simple narratives. The law did not offer emotional closure. It offered process. The repeated changes highlighted a fundamental reality of justice systems. Verdicts are not declarations of absolute truth. They are legal conclusions reached under specific standards, open to challenge when those standards are questioned. As the appeals continued, the case became less about a single night and more about the nature of evidence, the limits of forensic certainty, and the responsibility of courts to correct themselves when doubt is established. For the family of the victim, this period was especially difficult. Legal reversals do not undo loss. They prolong uncertainty. Each new decision reopened wounds, extending a process that had already taken years. Eventually, the highest courts issued final rulings that brought an end to the appellate cycle for certain defendants. These rulings did not claim to explain everything that had happened. They addressed only what could be legally sustained. By the end of this phase, the case had transformed into a lesson in judicial complexity. It showed how law can move slowly, revisit itself, and change direction without apology, because its obligation is not to consistency, but to fairness. The appeals and reversals did not erase what had occurred. They reshaped how responsibility was legally defined. and they left behind a case remembered not only for its tragedy, but for the long, winding path justice took in trying to understand it. Rudy Guedi emerged as a distinct figure within the case, separate from the shifting legal outcomes that surrounded others. His involvement followed a different legal path, one that reached a level of finality earlier and remained consistent through later appeals and reversals elsewhere. Guedi was identified during the early stages of the investigation through evidence that placed him at the scene. Unlike other aspects of the case, this connection did not rely on complex interpretation or contested timelines. His presence was established through material findings that he did not successfully dispute. He was arrested in Germany, where he had traveled shortly after the crime. Following extradition to Italy, he chose to be tried separately, using a fast-track procedure within the Italian legal system. This choice reduced the length of proceedings in exchange for a limited reduction in potential sentencing, a mechanism available under Italian law. During his trial, Guedi acknowledged being present in the house on the night Meredith was killed. However, he denied sole responsibility for the crime and claimed that others were involved. These claims were examined by the court, but they were not supported by evidence sufficient to alter the court's conclusions regarding his role. The court found Guedi guilty of murder and sexual violence. His conviction was based on forensic evidence, corroborated timelines, and his own admissions regarding presence at the scene. Unlike other verdicts in the case, his conviction was not overturned on appeal. Guedi pursued appeals through the Italian court system, as was his legal right. These appeals focused on the degree of responsibility and the interpretation of certain aspects of the crime. While his sentence was modified slightly over time, the core finding of guilt remained intact. Ultimately, his conviction became final. The courts affirmed that he bore criminal responsibility for Meredith's death. This legal outcome did not claim to answer every question about the night, but it did establish accountability within the boundaries of the evidence presented. The contrast between Guedi's case and the broader legal proceedings surrounding others is significant. While other verdicts shifted and were revisited, his legal status remained stable. This distinction is important when separating confirmed outcomes from disputed interpretations. Guedi's conviction stands as the only legally finalized determination of guilt in the case. It represents a point of certainty within a broader narrative marked by complexity and reversal. In the quiet context of this story, his legal outcome does not provide closure in an emotional sense. It provides definition. It marks one element of the case that reached resolution, even as other aspects continued to resist it. And so, within a case often remembered for its uncertainty, Rudy Guedi's conviction remains one of the few elements that the courts ultimately did not undo. As the years passed and court decisions accumulated, the case became defined not only by what happened, but by how carefully facts needed to be separated from interpretation. This distinction matters, especially in cases where public discussion grows louder than the evidence itself. There are certain facts that were established and did not change. Meredith Kercher was killed in the house she shared with others in Perugia. The time frame of her death was narrowed through forensic analysis. Evidence confirmed that Rudy Guedi was present at the scene, and his conviction for the crime became legally final. These points form the stable foundation of the case. They are supported by material evidence, court findings, and final judgments. They do not depend on opinion, media framing, or speculation. They remain constant, regardless of how the broader narrative has been debated. Beyond these confirmed facts lies a wider area of dispute. This includes interpretations of forensic evidence, assessments of investigative procedure, and conclusions drawn during earlier trials that were later overturned. These disputed elements are not false by default, but they are not settled in the same way confirmed facts are. Some forensic findings were later criticized for how they were collected or interpreted. Courts questioned whether certain conclusions exceeded what the evidence could reliably support. This did not mean the evidence was imaginary, but that its meaning was less certain than initially presented. Public claims often extended further than official findings. Media coverage, commentary, and discussions sometimes blurred the line between what courts determined and what people believed must have happened. Over time, repeated narratives can take on the appearance of truth, even when they are not legally sustained. It is also important to recognize what courts did not claim. Acquittals and reversals did not declare alternative versions of events as fact. They did not replace one narrative with another. They identified reasonable doubt and procedural issues, and they limited conclusions accordingly. This distinction is often misunderstood. Legal outcomes do not always answer every question. Sometimes they define the boundaries of certainty and stop there. In this case, the highest courts ultimately determined what could and could not be legally affirmed. The space between confirmed facts and disputed claims is where discomfort often lives. It is a space that resists closure. It asks listeners to tolerate uncertainty rather than resolve it prematurely. For many, this is the hardest part of the story to accept. Separating fact from dispute does not diminish the seriousness of the crime. It respects it. It acknowledges that truth is not strengthened by assumption, but by restraint, by naming what is known clearly and leaving the rest unnamed. In long-running cases, this discipline becomes essential. Without it, stories harden into myths, and speculation replaces understanding. The legal process, at its best, acts as a boundary against that drift. In the end, this case asks for careful listening rather than decisive belief. It asks that confirmed facts be held firmly and disputed claims be held lightly. And it reminds us that justice is not always about filling every gap, but about knowing which gaps must remain open until evidence, not desire, is ready to close them. Over time, the case moved beyond courtrooms and police files and into the wider public consciousness. Media coverage expanded far beyond Italy, reaching audiences across Europe and beyond. What had begun as a local investigation became an international story, shaped as much by interpretation and commentary as by legal process. With that attention came simplification. Complex legal decisions were often reduced to headlines. Nuance was lost as timelines were condensed and judicial reasoning summarized into brief conclusions. The longer the case lasted, the harder it became for the public to separate evolving legal outcomes from the original event itself. Law and media operate at different speeds. Courts move slowly, deliberately, and often quietly. Media moves quickly, responding to change with immediacy. In this case, that difference created tension. Legal reversals that were part of normal judicial review were sometimes framed as dramatic twists rather than procedural steps. For those directly affected, this ongoing attention carried weight. Legal outcomes did not exist in isolation. They unfolded alongside public debate, opinion pieces, and repeated retellings of the same moments. The passage of time did not reduce visibility. In many ways, it intensified it. The case also became a reference point in broader discussions about justice systems, forensic reliability, and media responsibility. It was cited in conversations about how evidence is interpreted, how narratives form, and how public pressure can shape perception long before final rulings are reached. Within the legal system, the case left a lasting imprint. Court decisions emphasized the importance of evidentiary standards and careful reasoning. The process demonstrated how appellate review functions not as an admission of failure, but as a safeguard against error. For Meredith's family, the legacy was not theoretical. It was personal. Legal outcomes, media attention, and public debate did not change the reality of loss. Over time, the case became less about verdicts and more about remembrance, about holding on to the person at the center of the story rather than the arguments surrounding it. As years passed, the intensity of coverage gradually softened, But the case did not disappear. It settled into a quieter place, remembered not only for what happened, but for how long the search for legal clarity continued. Legacy, in cases like this, is not singular. It exists in law books, in journalism, in academic discussion, and in private memory. It carries lessons about restraint, patience, and the limits of certainty. And as time continues forward, the case remains a reminder that justice is often a process rather than a moment, a slow unfolding that leaves behind questions alongside conclusions, and asks future observers to approach it with care rather than certainty. As the night deepens now, it is okay to let this story settle gently in the background and then drift away. You do not need to hold on to the details, the timelines, or the questions that remain. They can rest here, contained, without asking anything more of you. If you are lying down, allow your body to soften into the surface beneath you. Notice the quiet weight of the room. The day has finished its work. The outside world has slowed, and nothing is required of you in this moment. Cases like this remind us that truth does not always arrive cleanly or all at once. Sometimes it unfolds over years, shaped by law, interpretation, and patience. And sometimes, even after all that time, parts of the story remain unresolved. Tonight, you do not need to resolve them. Take a slow, steady breath in, and let it go without effort. The mind often wants to reach for conclusions, to organize events into something complete. But rest does not require completion. Rest arrives when we allow the searching to pause, even briefly. As you listen, you may notice thoughts fading in and out. Let them pass without attachment. You do not need to follow them. They can move through you like quiet shadows and then disappear. Meredith's story, like many others told here, is one of ordinary life interrupted and then examined carefully over time. It is not meant to stay with you in sharp detail. It is meant to soften, to lose its edges, and eventually to dissolve into the calm of the night. Let the sound of this voice become less distinct now. It can blend into the stillness around you, steady and unobtrusive. You do not need to listen closely anymore. You can simply allow it to exist. There is nothing left to understand tonight. Nothing left to decide. Nothing left to hold. Your breathing can slow naturally. Your shoulders can relax. Your jaw can loosen. Sleep does not need to be invited. It will arrive when the body is ready. Thank you for spending this quiet time here, for listening patiently, and for allowing these stories to be told gently and without urgency. For now, let the room fade further into darkness. Let the thoughts grow quiet, and allow yourself to rest, knowing that it is safe to let go. Good night.